Hello, and welcome to another episode of ADHD History. I'm your host, Xander Millette, here to deliver unto your ears some more fascinating stories of historical significance. Well, significant to me at least. Last time I said this episode was going to be about the fall of Rome and the Great Schism. Well, I got sidetracked by something else. Just a heads up, this episode talks about the LGBT+ community while sometimes using outdated terms, as well as descriptions of Nazi violence and concentration camps. So if that's not your cup of tea, I'd recommend skipping this episode, as it does get rather dark towards the end. Just so you all are aware, there are a lot of German words in this episode, and I do not speak German. So please forgive me in advance for the absolute butchering of the language that I am going to do. As for the people who choose to stick around, we're going to jump backwards in time to just before World War II in Berlin, Germany. In May 1933, Nazi youth stormed the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, carried roughly 15,000 books, unpublished manuscripts, scientific studies, and research papers from the library, and threw them into vans that carried them away to later be burned in bonfires in the streets. Decades of research were lost to the blaze, and it would take 30 years for it to resume in any significant capacity. The founder of the Institute, Magnus Hirschfeld, died 2 years after the destruction, and his name faded into obscurity. Despite having a significant amount of writing attributed to him, very few of his works were translated from their original German. It wasn't until 1994, and then again in the early 2000s, that his work began to be observed once more. Now, Hirschfeld is regarded as one of the fathers of the modern gay rights movement. His research is often referenced in scientific studies, despite it having been nearly a century since his death. In this episode, I'm going to take you on a journey through time to explore the remarkable history of the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, or the Institute for Sexual Science in English. To truly appreciate the significance of the Institute, it's crucial to dive into the history of early 20th century Germany and a little bit before. This era was marked by a complex interplay of political, social, and cultural forces that set the stage for the Institute's emergence and the revolutionary work it carried out. Germany was a nation undergoing intense transformation. Before World War I, in 1864, there was a man named Karl Ulrichs. His writings and actions helped inspire the world's first movement for homosexual rights, launched just over 30 years later in Berlin, 1897. Yay! Ulrichs had been forced to resign from his legal career after he was outed as gay, so he turned to writing pamphlets for distribution, arguing that homosexuality was not against nature. In his first pamphlet, Vindex, Social and Legal Studies on Man-Manly Love, introduced new terms for describing sexual identities. The word earning was for men who loved their own sex, and the word dioning described the heterosexual majority. The pamphlet's title, Vindex, or Vindicator in English, showed Ulrich's purpose, framing himself as the defender of all earnings, persecuted by the dioning majority. His central thesis was that earning love was natural, caused neither by pathology or willful perversion, and as such could not and should not be criminalized. His second pamphlet, Inclusa, Anthropological Studies on Man-Manly Love, was published a month later and introduced the term Erdenen to describe those women who preferred their own gender. He also presented evidence that earnings were psychological hermaphrodites, or biological men with feminine characteristics. One of his examples of this was that when gay men formed social networks, they often gave each other feminine nicknames, such as Schwester and Tante, or sister and aunt in English. His third pamphlet, Vindica, Battle for Freedom from Persecution, described the legal ramifications of German anti-sodomy laws, such as imprisonment and suicide rates. The fourth, Formatrix, Anthropological Studies on Man-Manly Love, suggested a wide variety of sexual identities, such as Urandianism, those individuals who are attracted to both genders. The fifth pamphlet, Ara Spe, or Refuge of Hope in English, Ulrichs argued against Christianity's condemnation of gay men. He wrote that while the Bible condemned same-sex prostitution and those who perverted their nature, it said nothing about those with an inborn earning nature. And since earnings could not produce children, neither the institution of marriage nor sanctions against extramarital sex held any particular bearing on earnings. Of course, this just completely ignored the traditional Christian teaching that sex should only be for procreation. The print run was limited for the pamphlets, but their distribution was wider than anyone expected. Ulrichs definitely achieved his goal of stimulating debate about the treatment of homosexuals, and the threat of censorship of the pamphlets enhanced their sales. By 1900, the term earning was commonly used in German, and many gay men wrote to the publisher of the pamphlets expressing their appreciation of the knowledge that they weren't alone in the world. Section 175 of the Criminal Code of the German Empire criminalized homosexual activity between men over the age of 18 and was enacted in 1871. However, the death penalty for such had been abolished by the early 19th century, a striking counterpoint to Britain, who only overturned the death penalty for sodomy in 1868. France, on the other hand, had established the principle of shielding private consensual relations from state control with the French Revolution, and chose not to include an anti-sodomy law in their criminal code. France influenced much of Europe's legal culture, and other countries adopted this progressive stance. Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and most Italian states rescinded their laws punishing sodomy. In 1879, Ulrichs completed his 12th and final pamphlet, Christliche Pfeifle. Wow, I did not pronounce that correctly. Critical Arrows in English. In it, he conceded the unlikelihood of eliminating the sodomy statute and called for further research and study. He died in 1895, never having seen his dream of legal reform for homosexuals realized. But he left a lasting legacy behind. He was arguably the first man in modern history to publicly out himself as being attracted to other men. His theories were largely ignored by the German medical establishment, but they did influence a group of progressive psychiatric and legal professionals to accept same-sex attraction as a natural phenomenon. He also developed the first vocabulary for describing modern sexual identities, though earning and dioning were later erased by homosexual and heterosexual. His greatest achievement, however, is the fact that he inspired the founding of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which was the world's first homosexual rights organization, and the subsequent building of the Institut for Sexualwissenschaft. The committee honored Ulrichs by conducting research to reconstruct his life and biography, as well as republishing his 12 revolutionary pamphlets. In 1885, Berlin's police commissioner was a man named Leopold von Meerscheidt Holissim. My apologies to him and any of his descendants for my complete inability to pronounce his name. He was known within the gay community as the official who first tolerated gay bars and costume balls despite homosexuality being illegal. He established the Department of Homosexuals, or Homosexuellen Dezernat, after a raid on a place called Seeger's Restaurant. The raid saw a few men arrested for perceived homosexual activity, even though all the men were doing was eating at the establishment. The convictions were mostly based on the fact that the police officers were uncomfortable. There was little precedent for the department, and Holissim was able to use it to introduce a general principle of tolerating Berlin's gay bars and entertainments. Since Berlin was expanding rapidly, it wasn't cost-effective to monitor every park and bar. Instead of aggressively policing potential homosexual activity, which would drive it underground and make it harder to police, The new approach was to tolerate it, within certain limits. Hullissem actually gave tours of Berlin's homosexual night spots and escorted visitors to same-sex costume balls. One of these visitors was playwright August Strindberg, who wrote of his experience. He wrote of himself in third person as the author. Quote, "It was the most horrible thing he had ever seen. In order that a better check might be kept on them, the perverts of the capital had been given permission to hold a fancy dress ball. When it opened, everyone behaved ceremoniously, almost as if they were in a madhouse. Men danced with men, mournfully, with deadly seriousness. The one playing the lady's role might have the mustache of a cavalryman and pince-nez. He might be ugly, with coarse masculine features and not even a trace of femininity. The police inspector and his guest had seated themselves at a table in the center of one end of the room, close to which all the couples had to pass. The inspector called them by their Christian names and summoned some of the most interesting among them to his table so that the author could study them. In the female section, where women danced with women, the most noteworthy was a stately lady. Her eyes followed a radiant young blonde. The inspector informed the author that the two were bound together by passionate love for each other, and that, as the elder woman was poor, the younger one supported her by selling herself to men she abhorred." End quote. By the 1920s, Berlin had nearly 100 gay and lesbian bars, restaurants, and cafes. Vienna had about a dozen gay cafes, clubs, and bookstores. In Paris, certain quarters were renowned for open displays of gay and trans nightlife. Florence, in Italy, had its own gay district, as did many smaller European cities. But back to Berlin. There was a bar called the Mikado that was arguably the most stylish of the homosexual bars. It was fashioned after a Japanese tea house and featured paper lanterns and silk screens. It was also very reputable. The owner took the bathroom door off its hinges, so no one could claim indecent activities took place there. It became a hangout for the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. One member, Baron Willibald von Sadler-Grün, would play piano there, usually in drag. Another, author Adolf Brand, began writing Der Hygiene, the world's first homosexual journal, and selling it at the Mikado. The aftermath of World War I left the country grappling with economic turmoil and a fractured political landscape. The Weimar Republic, established in 1919, ushered in a brief but vibrant period of democratic experimentation and cultural innovation. Culturally, Germany witnessed a flourishing of the arts, with the Bauhaus movement, expressionist literature, and experimental theater gaining prominence. This atmosphere of intellectualism provided rich ground for discussion around human sexuality and identity, which the Institut would actively engage in. But at the same time, there was a resurgence of conservative values and sentiments in Germany. Many individuals and groups sought to return to traditional social and moral norms, viewing the Institute's progressive approach to sexuality and gender as a threat to those values. The political landscape in Germany during this period was marked by the rise of nationalist and reactionary movements, which often aligned themselves with conservative ideologies. These groups saw the Institute's work as contrary to their vision of a homogeneous and morally upright society. Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld was a prominent physician, sexologist, and social reformer with a deep commitment to scientific inquiry and social justice. He started the Scientific Humanitarian Committee after the suicide of a homosexual patient who died on the eve of his wedding. He entrusted Hirschfeld with a letter for his family, in which he directly blamed paragraph 175, the anti-sodomy statute, for his death. It was an epiphany for Hirschfeld, a gay man himself, and it set the standard for the rest of his career. Though his theories developed and evolved throughout his life, his first publication, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the proper German title, was called Sappho and Socrates, and it introduced a viewpoint that he never stopped promoting. Sexual orientation was biological. Hirschfeld also coined the term transvestite in his third publication, and conducted extensive studies on gender identity throughout his career. The term at the time incorporated both those who dressed in drag and those who wanted to be the opposite sex, but he also started the work on separating the two into their own distinct categories. So, just to recap, Germans gave us our current term, homosexuality, started the first gay rights organization, published the first homosexual magazine, and started our modern understanding of transgender peoples. Germany also had the world's first homosexual newspaper that was openly sold at kiosks and had a broad popular appeal. They also produced the first movie to address the social and legal troubles of homosexuals, titled in English, Different from the Others, and Hirschfeld himself had a role in the film. Thanks, Germany! Hirschfeld's vision for the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft was rooted in a profound belief that scientific knowledge could challenge prejudice and discrimination against those with non-normative sexualities and gender identities. He sought to create a space where scholars, researchers, and individuals could openly explore the complexities of human sexuality and contribute to a more inclusive society. Hirschfeld founded his institute in 1919 with his own money. After purchasing an adjacent property in 1921, the complex had more than 50 rooms. A library, an auditorium, and a surgical unit were built. Hirschfeld's personal quarters and the museum were on the second floor, along with the X-ray apparatus and the laboratories. The first floor had the reception area, waiting rooms, and consultation rooms. The basement housed the domestic staff and the kitchen. Hirschfeld's lover, Carl Gies, served as the archivist, librarian, and museum curator. The museum was a popular tourist destination and followed three themes: variation in sexual orientation, the diversity of sexual drives, and an ethnography of sexual expression from various world cultures. Most of the museum was just charts and photographs on the walls, but there were also cases filled with objects. Most notably, Hirschfeld's personal collection of phalluses from all around the globe. Fun fact, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was one of the museum's visitors.
Ooh. Ah.
The first few years, the Institute was mainly for academic research and study, but was soon followed by medical treatment for patients, most significantly, venereal diseases. It offered counseling services and medical consultations, recognizing that many individuals face significant mental health challenges due to societal prejudice and discrimination. Hirschfeld's commitment to education was evident in his efforts to provide accurate information about sexuality, dispel myths, and foster empathy and acceptance. The Institute didn't just cater to the homosexual community. They also had a center of sexual counseling for married couples that provided counseling and, more importantly, birth control. This was particularly brave as advertising birth control was prohibited. The cost of an exam and a prescription pretty much guaranteed the working and lower class could not afford it, so the Institute focused their efforts on them. The Institute's work also involved collecting vast amounts of data on sexual orientation. This research aimed to categorize and understand different sexual orientations, challenging the common view that homosexuality was a criminal or pathological condition. The Institute's findings were instrumental in debunking myths and stereotypes about LGBTQ+ individuals, contributing to the eventual destigmatization of homosexuality. Furthermore, the Institute conducted pioneering research on transgender individuals, recognizing the existence of gender diversity long before it gained broader acceptance. Hirschfeld and other sympathetic doctors would actually work with local authorities to issue transvestite passes. The owner of such a pass would be allowed to work and appear in public wearing the clothing of the opposite gender and produce official permission if harassed. Later, some of the first sex change operations were performed at the Institute. The outcomes of these surgeries were not favorable, but provided some very important stepping stones for later attempts. The most famous example of this was featured in the film The Danish Girl. The casting of a heterosexual cisgender man in the role of Lily Elbe is admittedly problematic, but the movie is decently accurate. Elbe had planned to die by suicide in May 1930, as she felt she had not been born in the right body. However, she did not go through with this plan, as she was informed of a man that could help her, Hirschfeld. Elbe's psychological health was evaluated by Hirschfeld through a series of tests. 4 operations were then carried out over a period of 2 years, funded by the sale of her paintings. All of Lily Elbe's medical documents were ruined during the Allied bombing raids, destroying the clinic and archives where the surgeries were performed. But we still know quite a lot. Her case was a sensation in Danish and German newspapers. Elbe was able to have her gender and name legally changed, even receiving a passport as Lily Isle Elvenes. After her 3rd surgery, Elbe returned to Dresden and began a relationship with French art dealer Claude Lejeune, who she wanted to marry and have children with. In 1931, Elbe returned for her 4th surgery, to transplant a uterus and construct a vaginal canal. Unfortunately, her immune system rejected the transplanted uterus. This ultimately caused an infection, which led to her death from cardiac arrest in September 1931, 3 months after the surgery. Rest in peace, Lily. Back to the Institute. I'm gonna butcher this, Sexualwissenschaftliche Bibliothek, or Sexuological Library in English, was curated and maintained by the Institute, and it served as a comprehensive reference for scholars, researchers, activists, and the public interested in sexual diversity. This extensive collection covered a wide range of topics related to sexuality, including homosexuality, transgender experiences, gender identity, sexual health, and relationships. It provided access to a wealth of scientific literature and historical materials that were previously scattered and often inaccessible. Moreover, the Sexuological Library had a global impact. Scholars and activists from around the world relied on its resources to inform their work and advocacy efforts. The knowledge provided through the library had a profound influence on the emerging LGBTQ+ rights movement, both in Germany and internationally. Hirschfeld also convened in Berlin the first International Congress on Sexual Science in 1921, which saw more than 3,000 participants from as far away as Tokyo, Peking, Moscow, and San Francisco. The second conference in 1928 in Copenhagen saw Hirschfeld officially form the World League for Sexual Reform, or the WSLR. A third conference met in London 1929, a fourth in Vienna 1930, and a fifth in Czechoslovakia in 1932. Further conferences planned for Paris, Moscow, and the United States were canceled, and the end of the WSLR was attributed to Hirschfeld's death in 1935. The Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany held significant influence, and conservative elements within these institutions were often critical of the Institute's research and advocacy. Their emphasis on scientific inquiry and secular understanding of sexuality clashed with religious teachings and traditional beliefs. Their progressive views on sexuality and gender stirred fears among conservative segments of society. These fears sometimes manifested as moral panic, with accusations that the Institute promoted immoral behavior. As political extremism, including fascism and Nazism, gained ground in Germany, The Institute's commitment to human rights, diversity, and LGBTQ+ advocacy put it at odds with these radical ideologies. Conservative and extremist forces saw the Institute as a symbol of moral decay and social subversion. Conservative pressures also led to legislative changes, such as increased censorship and restrictions on materials related to sexuality and gender. The German government introduced measures that curtailed the Institute's ability to provide information and collect research. The Institute faced public criticism and condemnation from conservative newspapers, political figures, and interest groups. It became a target of slander and vilification campaigns that aimed to discredit its work and reputation. Ultimately, this growing conservative backlash set the stage for the Institute's tragic fate. As the Nazi regime came to power in the 1930s, its vehement opposition to LGBTQ+ rights and non-normative sexualities led to the Institute's persecution and eventual closure. The Nazi regime sought to control information and suppress ideologies it viewed as threatening to its vision of a racially and morally pure society. Hirschfeld had gone on a world tour to promote his research, and as both a Jew and a gay man, he never returned to Germany. This turned out to be a good thing because the Nazi administration actively interrogated his staff as to his whereabouts. One of the most infamous book burning events took place on May 10, 1933, when German students organized book burnings across the country. This campaign, which included the participation of Nazi youth groups, targeted books authored by Jews, communists, pacifists, and advocates of sexual and gender diversity. The books were publicly burned in bonfires, symbolizing the Nazis' rejection of ideas they considered harmful to their agenda. The materials of the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft were specifically targeted by the Nazis, particularly its extensive library of sexuological literature. May 6, 1933, 100 students arrived at the Institute, broke down the door, and, accompanied by a freaking brass band, carried 15,000 plus books and research papers out of the library and threw them into the back of vans. They also looted and destroyed the museum. At noon, one of their leaders gave a speech, followed by the singing of the Horst Wessel song. They took a bust of Magnus Hirschfeld and left in their vans. Later that same day, members of the SA in uniform arrived and gathered up medical files and questionnaires. 4 days later, on the 10th, all the confiscated materials were thrown into the flames. A tragic loss. The book burnings were highly symbolic acts intended to convey a message of conformity and suppression of dissent. The Nazi regime sought to manipulate public opinion by presenting itself as a champion of traditional values while vilifying and erasing alternative perspectives on sexuality and gender. Many valuable historical and scientific works were destroyed, and the suppression of knowledge had a chilling effect on research and education. Not all of the Institute's materials were destroyed during the book burnings. Some items were confiscated by Nazi authorities and dispersed to private individuals. Some collectors or individuals with an interest in sexology and LGBT+ history may have acquired these materials knowingly or unknowingly during or after World War II. Some brave individuals associated with the Institute managed to save certain documents and materials from destruction by smuggling them out of Nazi Germany. These individuals risked their lives to protect the Institute's legacy, and their efforts were crucial in preserving some of its records. Despite these efforts, a significant portion of the Institute's materials was lost forever due to destruction, confiscation, and the chaos of World War II. Many valuable records and historical documents were irretrievably damaged or disappeared. After the fall of the Nazi regime, efforts were made to recover and preserve what remained of the Institute's materials. Some items were found in unexpected places or returned by individuals who had acquired them during the war. The Nazi regime's persecution of LGBT+ individuals extended beyond the Institute. In 1935, Himmler, the head of the SS, championed a new anti-sodomy statute, criminalizing all erotic contact between men. He also established the Reich Office to combat homosexuality and abortion. Thousands of LGBTQ+ individuals were arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to brutal medical experiments and castration, or put to death. More than 100,000 German men were charged, and an estimated 5,000 to 15,000 were sent to concentration camps. It's estimated that they had a 60 to 65% death rate, but the exact number of deaths is unknown due to systematic erasure. While Jews were made to wear yellow stars, gay men were made to wear pink triangles, and lesbians a black triangle for antisocials and anarchists. One of the few survivors who publicly shared his experience, Pierre Seal, described being tortured and forced to watch his lover be mauled by a pack of dogs. Another, Heinz Hager, told of being forced to trade sexual favors for protection and food in the camps. There are many other stories I've read while researching this episode that I will not repeat. Suffice to say, I've thrown up a few times and had more than a few sleepless nights. It took until 1985 for homosexuals to be publicly acknowledged as victims, and until 1994 for paragraph 175 to be stricken completely from the Criminal Code of Germany. The Nazi version of paragraph 175 was explicitly upheld in 1957 by the West German Supreme Court. Anti-gay laws and prejudice had existed before Hitler, argued the court, and therefore couldn't be seen as Nazi ideology. Of course, anti-Semitism, laws against the Roma, and sterilization of disabled people had all existed before 1933 as well, and those laws were repealed. But the Supreme Courts ignored this and claimed that paragraph 175 was necessary for the protection of the German people. Homosexuals were never legally acknowledged as victims of the Nazi regime and did not get a Nuremberg. Some even had to continue serving their sentences regardless of how much time they had already spent in the camps. In 2002, Germany pardoned those who were convicted under paragraph 175, and then it took until 2017 for Germany to vote to compensate the victims of paragraph 175. But by that point, all the known survivors had passed away, so it was largely ceremonial. The closure of the Institut and the suppression of LGBTQ+ rights during the Nazi era had enduring consequences. It took decades for LGBTQ+ rights to regain momentum in Germany, and the loss of the Institute's research and materials was a significant setback for the field of sexology. The similarities between the struggles of gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals of the 1900s and those of our current LGBTQ+ communities are striking. In 2022, more than 171 anti-trans bills and more than 300 anti-LGBT bills were introduced in at least 33 states in the U.S. Notably, Utah has become the first state to have the governor sign a law banning gender-affirming care for those under the age of 25. 27 states have zero discrimination protections for LGBTQ+ peoples. In those states, people can be fired, evicted, and denied medical care simply based on their sexual identity. In the United Kingdom, Parliament struck down a Scottish bill that would have made it easier to change gender markers on official documents. In Russia in 2013, a federal law criminalizing the distribution of materials among minors in support of same-sex relationships was enacted as an amendment to an existing child protection law. In 2017, many Chechen gay men were tortured and killed. Uganda passed the Sexual Offenses Bill under the guise of protecting victims of sexual violence, but it contains provisions that punish consensual same-sex acts, discriminate based on HIV status, and allow the death penalty to be enforced for certain offenses. Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Yemen maintain the death penalty for those convicted of homosexuality. In this episode, we've explored a chapter of history that is both harrowing and profoundly important to remember. The destruction of the Institut for Sexualwissenschaft and the persecution of LGBTQ+ individuals during the Nazi era are stark reminders of the darkest depths of intolerance and prejudice. By preserving the memory of the Institut for Sexualwissenschaft, we ensure that their stories are never forgotten. In remembering the victims of the Pink Triangle, we not only honor their memory, but also commit ourselves to a world where such persecution and discrimination have no place. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of history, resilience, and hope. As we conclude this episode, may we remember the past, learn from it, and work tirelessly to create a brighter and more inclusive future for all. I want to give personal thanks to the books Gay Berlin by Robert Beachy, The Men with the Pink Triangle by Heinz Hager, Pink Triangle Legacies by W. Jake Newsom, Magnus Hirschfeld and the Origins of the Gay Liberation Movement by Ralph Doss, Magnus Hirschfeld and the Quest for Sexual Freedom by Elena Mancini, and Sexuality and German Fascism by Dagmar Herzog for all the research help, as well as the countless websites I've hit up for information. Hope to have you listen in to my next episode. After this heavy of a topic, I'm thinking something lighter next time, possibly the stories of some of the Roman emperors. You can find me on my Facebook page, ADHD History, and on Twitter and Instagram at It's ADHD History. See you next time. Ciao, ciao.